I found out he was a mafia boss 3 days after I told a room full of strangers that villains were the only honest people in fiction. 3 days later, I argued passionately that monsters deserve understanding, not condemnation. 3 days after, a man in a corner of a bookshop looked at me like I'd just unlocked something sacred inside him and whispered words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Finally, someone who understands, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To truly understand how a 29-year-old adjunct professor with a caffeine addiction and chronically overdue library books ended up becoming the most protected woman in Chicago's criminal underworld, I need to take you back to that Tuesday evening when everything changed, when I opened my mouth to defend a fictional villain and accidentally caught the attention of a very real one. My name is Vivian Cross, and I run a book club in a shop called Chapter and Verse in Lincoln Park. Not because it pays well. It doesn't pay at all, actually. I do it because, somewhere between finishing my PhD in Victorian literature and realizing that academic careers are where idealistic dreams quietly suffocate, I discovered that discussing books with strangers was the only thing keeping me tethered to a sense of purpose. That particular Tuesday, we were discussing The Prince of Shadows, a literary thriller about a crime lord named Marcus Vane, who'd built an empire on blood and betrayal. The book had divided our club straight down the middle. Half the members thought Marcus was an irredeemable monster. The other half understood what the author was really exploring, the terrifying question of what any of us might become if circumstances demanded it. I didn't notice him come in. That's the first thing you need to understand about Dante Russo. He moves like smoke, like shadow, like something that exists in peripheral vision, until suddenly he's directly in front of you, and you realize you've been watched all along. Later, he would tell me that observing without being observed was a survival skill he'd learned before he was old enough to understand why he needed it. At the time, I just thought the corner of the poetry section was empty. The debate was heating up. Margot Chen, a corporate lawyer who treated book club like a courtroom, was making her closing arguments against Marcus Vane with the confidence of someone who'd never faced a moral dilemma more complex than choosing between salad options. "He's a murderer," she declared, her voice slicing through the comfortable murmur of the bookshop. The author gives him a tragic backstory to elicit readers' sympathy. But trauma doesn't excuse the choices we make. Marcus Vane chose violence. He chose power over principle. Defending him means defending the idea that some people exist above consequences. Heads nodded around our circle of mismatched armchairs. Margot had articulated the comfortable morality of comfortable people. The kind of ethical certainty that only survives when you've never been forced to choose between bad options and worse ones. I should have stayed quiet. My therapist, Elena, had been working with me on not always being the one to challenge assumptions, on letting other people occasionally carry the weight of intellectual dissent. But something about Margot's certainty, that polished conviction of someone who'd never had to get her hands dirty, sparked the fire I'd been carrying since childhood. "You're conflating sympathy with absolution," I said, stepping into the center of our circle. The author isn't asking us to forgive Marcus or approve of his choices. She's asking us to understand how someone becomes the villain of their own story. That's utterly different from moral endorsement. Margot's perfectly shaped eyebrows arched. Understanding is just a polite word for excusing. No. My voice came out stronger than I intended, carrying the conviction of years spent thinking about precisely this question. Understanding is how we prevent the next villain from being created. If we dismiss monsters as simply evil, as incomprehensible aberrations, we lose the ability to recognize the conditions that give rise to them. I was pacing now, the way I always did when ideas took hold of me. Marcus Vane wasn't born a crime lord, I continued. He was manufactured by a system that gave him exactly two choices: be destroyed, or become the destroyer. The tragedy isn't that he chose the wrong thing. The tragedy is that the choice existed at all. In the corner of the poetry section, a shadow shifted. Later, Dante would tell me that was the moment he sat up straighter, the moment his attention transformed from casual observation to focused intensity. At the time, I felt only a vague prickle of awareness, like being watched by something I couldn't quite see. "The book examines power structures," I said. my voice filling the space between the shelves of carefully organized fiction. Marcus operates within a world that only respects strength. In that world, showing mercy isn't a virtue. It's suicide. The author forces us to confront something we'd rather ignore. Morality is contextual. The ethical rules that govern civilized society don't apply in spaces where it has already abandoned its responsibilities. That's nihilism, Margot interrupted. You're arguing that nothing matters because situations are difficult. I turned to face her directly. I'm arguing that everything matters precisely because situations are difficult. Marcus Vane is the most moral character in that entire book, because he's the only one who honestly confronts what morality costs. The room had gone very quiet. The particular silence of people witnessing someone reveal more of themselves than perhaps they intended. Everyone else in that story hides behind institutions. I continued. They hide behind principles that someone else enforces, laws that someone else upholds. They get to feel righteous because they've outsourced the ugly work to people they'd rather not think about. But Marcus has to decide every single day what he's willing to do to protect the people he loves. He carries the weight of those choices personally, permanently. That's not nihilism. That's the most demanding form of ethics. I stopped pacing. My heart was beating too fast, the way it always did when I touched on ideas that genuinely moved me. Around the circle, faces reflected varying degrees of discomfort, fascination, and, in Margot's case, outright hostility. Finally, the word came from the corner, soft as a held breath, carrying an accent I couldn't place. Finally, someone who understands. I turned toward the voice and my whole body went still. He stood between two bookcases, dressed in charcoal wool that probably cost more than 3 months of my adjunct salary. Dark hair silvered at the temples. Mediterranean features arranged in an expression of focused intensity that made my skin prickle with sudden, inexplicable awareness. Not tall, maybe 5'10", but occupying space with the authority of someone who'd never needed height to command a room. His eyes were what held me. Dark brown, almost black, watching me with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time. Not the polite attention of someone humoring an intellectual tangent. Something far more dangerous. The recognition of a kindred spirit. "I'm sorry," Margot said, her voice carrying frost. "This is a private discussion." The man stepped forward, and something about the movement, fluid, controlled, inherently predatory, made the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. My apologies for the interruption. His voice was soft, the kind of quiet that made you lean in to hear. I couldn't resist commenting on such a refreshingly honest analysis. He was looking directly at me now, only at me, as though Margot and the others had ceased to exist entirely. "Most people," he continued, "are afraid to admit that morality requires ugly choices. They prefer comfortable condemnation from a safe distance. But you." His gaze traveled across my face, cataloging and assessing. "You understand that sometimes there are no clean hands, only degrees of necessity." I should have been afraid. Every warning instinct I possessed should have been screaming at me to step back, to end the conversation, to recognize that this man radiated danger the way a furnace radiates heat. Instead, I heard myself say, "You sound like you're speaking from experience." His smile was a blade, barely there and twice as sharp, more than you could imagine. The book club dissolved around us like morning fog. I was vaguely aware of Margot gathering her things with pointed efficiency, of other members exchanging meaningful glances as they filtered toward the exit. But my attention remained fixed on the stranger who watched me with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for exactly what he wanted. Cassandra, the bookshop owner, appeared at my elbow with the particular wariness of a small business owner assessing potential trouble. "We're closing in 20 minutes, she announced, her gaze flickering between the man and me in the expensive suit. Of course. He reached into his jacket, a movement so casual that I almost missed the way Cassandra stiffened, the way her hand drifted toward the counter where I knew she kept pepper spray after a string of late-night incidents last summer. But he only withdrew a wallet, extracting several bills that he pressed into her palm, for the inconvenience of my unexpected attendance. and for whatever the professor here is drinking. Cassandra looked down at the money in her hand, and her expression shifted from suspicion to something closer to shock. This is way too much for coffee. Consider it an appreciation for fostering genuine intellectual discourse in an age of shallow opinions. His attention returned to me, and I felt that intensity like a physical weight. May I buy you a drink, Professor Cross? I find myself hungry for conversation that doesn't bore me to death. I should have said no. Every practical instinct I possessed, honed by years of navigating academic politics and Chicago dating scenes, screamed that this man was dangerous in ways I couldn't yet articulate. Strangers who appeared from shadows to complement your villain analysis and throw around $100 bills like confetti were not strangers you followed to secondary locations. But I'd spent my entire life being sensible. I'd chosen the safe path, the expected path, the path that led to a PhD I couldn't monetize, and an adjunct career that barely paid for groceries. Just once, I wanted to do something that didn't make practical sense. There's a wine bar 2 blocks east, I heard myself say. They stay open until midnight. His smile deepened, revealing something that might have been genuine pleasure beneath the carefully controlled exterior. Led the way, Professor. We walked through the October chill, leaves crunching beneath our feet on sidewalks illuminated by streetlights that cast everything in amber and shadow. He moved beside me with an effortless grace that suggested physical capability I couldn't quite define. Not the bulk of someone who spent hours in a gym, but something leaner, more efficient. The economy of movement that comes from necessity rather than vanity. You knew my name, I said, breaking the silence that had stretched between us, back in the shop. You called me Professor Cross, but I never introduced myself. He didn't miss a step. Your book club has a modest online presence. I may have done some research before attending. The answer was plausible enough, but something about the way he delivered it, too smooth, too rehearsed, made my instincts prickle. You researched a random book club in Lincoln Park? I research everything that interests me. His gaze slid toward me, assessing. You'd be surprised how rarely I encounter genuinely interesting things. The wine bar was called Noir, which should have been my first warning about the direction this evening was heading. Dark interior, intimate tables, the kind of ambient jazz that suggested secrets were meant to be shared here. The hostess took one look at my companion and immediately led us to a corner booth with clear sightlines to both exits. She didn't ask for his preference. She knew. You come here often, I observed as we settled into leather seats that probably cost more than my couch. Occasionally. He ordered a bottle of something Italian that I didn't recognize, and the sommelier practically genuflected before retreating, when I need to think without being disturbed. And yet you're here with me, disturbing your thinking. That almost smile again, blade sharp and dangerous. You are a different kind of disturbance, Professor Cross, the type I've been seeking for longer than you could know. The wine arrived with ceremony. He poured for both of us, his movements precise, practiced, entirely at odds with the casual setting. Everything about this man spoke of deliberate control, of surfaces that concealed depths I couldn't begin to fathom. You argued that villains deserve understanding rather than condemnation, he said, swirling wine in his glass with the contemplative air of someone about to ask something important. Do you believe that applies to real villains as well? Or only fictional ones? The question landed like a thrown knife, pinning me in place. That depends, I said carefully, on your definition of villain. A man who has done terrible things. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but his eyes had gone hard as obsidian. A man who has ordered violence, who has built power on foundations that polite society would find abhorrent. A man who made choices that can never be unmade, justified by circumstances that can never be fully explained. Does such a man deserve understanding? My heart was pounding now, loud enough that I wondered if he could hear it. Are we still talking about Marcus Vane? He held my gaze for a long moment, and I saw something flicker behind his carefully controlled expression. Something vulnerable, ancient, and desperately lonely. We're talking about whether understanding is possible, he said finally, when the whole truth can never be told. Whether someone like you, someone who sees the humanity in fictional monsters, could extend the same grace to a real one. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications I wasn't sure I wanted to examine. I think, I said slowly, that the willingness to ask that question suggests you're not the monster you believe yourself to be. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprised, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of being seen in a way he hadn't expected. You don't know what I've done. No, I agreed. But I know what monsters look like when they talk about themselves. They don't ask whether they deserve understanding. They assume they already have it, or they don't care whether they do. The fact that you're asking means some part of you still believes the answer might be yes. He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an intensity that felt like being slowly unwrapped. You're either remarkably insightful, he said finally, or extraordinarily naive, probably both. I took a sip of wine that I couldn't taste. Most interesting people are. His laugh caught me off guard, low and genuine and rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a very long time. I think you might be the most dangerous person I've met in years, Professor Cross. Coming from you, I have a feeling that's quite the statement. He leaned forward, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Something subtle and expensive that made my head swim slightly. You have no idea, he murmured. His phone buzzed, shattering the moment. He glanced at the screen, and I watched his expression transform. The warmth that had been building in his eyes vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating and utterly foreign to the man who'd been laughing moments before. I apologize. He was already standing, reaching for his wallet. An urgent matter requires my attention. He placed a business card on the table between us. Simple cream cardstock, elegant font. Just a name and a phone number. Dante Russo. I enjoyed our conversation more than I can adequately express, he said, his voice formal now, controlled. I hope you'll allow me to continue at another time. And then he was gone, moving through the wine bar with that unsettling grace, disappearing into the October night as he'd never existed at all. I sat alone in the booth, staring at the card in my hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to Google his name. It took me exactly 4 seconds to understand why that hostess had known where to seat him, why the sommelier had practically bowed, why everything about Dante Russo radiated a danger I couldn't define. The search results filled my screen with headlines I didn't want to believe. Alleged crime boss Dante Russo questioned in federal investigation. The Russo family maintains its grip on Chicago territory despite RICO attempts. The Prince of Lincoln Park, inside Chicago's most sophisticated criminal empire. I dropped my phone as it had burned me. The man who'd bought me wine and quoted my own arguments back at me. The man who'd asked whether villains deserved understanding with something like hope in his voice. The man whose laugh had sounded rusty from disuse. He was the real thing. And he had my name, my workplace, and apparently a particular interest in continuing our conversation. The rational thing to do was to forget about Dante Russo entirely. Delete his number, avoid chapter and verse on Tuesday nights. Pretend that the most electrifying conversation of my adult life had happened with a perfectly normal man who definitely wasn't connected to organized crime. I am nothing if not rational, which is why I spent the next 72 hours obsessively researching everything I could find about the Russo family, instead of grading the stack of freshman essays decomposing on my kitchen table. The rabbit hole went deep, deeper than I expected and far darker. The Russo family had controlled significant portions of Chicago's criminal infrastructure for 3 generations. Dante's grandfather, Salvatore Russo, had emigrated from Sicily in 1952 and built an empire on gambling, protection, and what journalists euphemistically called labor negotiations. His son, Marco Russo, had expanded into construction, real estate, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for less legitimate enterprises. But Dante was different. Every article I found emphasized this point, with varying degrees of skepticism. Since taking control of the family at age 28, following his father's assassination by a rival organization, Dante had systematically transformed their operations. He'd divested from drug trafficking entirely. He'd established strict codes about civilian involvement. He'd made enemies of more violent factions by refusing to engage in the brutality that had characterized his father's reign. The Prince of Lincoln Park, one journalist had called him. A mafia boss who quoted philosophy and funded scholarships at inner-city schools. A crime lord who'd never been successfully prosecuted because he inspired loyalty rather than fear, because witnesses refused to testify, not from intimidation, but from genuine belief that he was somehow different from the monsters who'd come before. I didn't know what to do with any of this information. The man I'd met at the bookshop, the man who'd asked whether villains deserved understanding, with something like desperate hope in his voice, didn't match the criminal mastermind described in federal indictments, but neither did he match the sanitized Robin Hood figure that some articles seemed to suggest. The truth, as always, probably lived somewhere in the complicated middle. I should have stopped reading. I should have put down my phone, graded those essays, gone back to my ordinary life of adjunct teaching in book clubs and pretending that Tuesday night had never happened. Instead, I picked up his business card and stared at the phone number until my eyes blurred. He found me first. It was Saturday afternoon, and I was hunched over a corner table at my usual coffee shop, attempting to translate my handwritten notes on Victorian mortality rates into something resembling a coherent lecture. The shop was crowded with the normal weekend mix of students, remote workers, and couples on aggressively wholesome dates. I'd chosen a seat facing the wall specifically to avoid distraction, which is why I didn't see him approach until his shadow fell across my notes. "The mortality rates among London's working class are truly staggering," he observed, his accented voice cutting through my concentration. I had no idea cholera was quite so democratically devastating. I looked up so fast I nearly knocked over my coffee. Dante Russo stood beside my table, dressed more casually than before in a charcoal sweater and dark jeans, looking for all the world like a handsome stranger making friendly conversation about academic research. No one around us spared him a second glance. He was invisible in plain sight, just another Saturday customer at a crowded coffee shop. "How did you find me?" I demanded, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. His expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment. "You researched me," he said. "It seemed only fair that I research you in return. I've been coming to this coffee shop for 2 years. There's no online presence that would lead you here." "No," he agreed, settling into the chair across from me without invitation. "There isn't." The implication hung between us, heavy and unsettling. "You had me follow. I had you protected." He said it casually, as if the distinction were obvious. "There's a difference. Protected from what?" "From the people who've noticed that I spent an evening in public conversation with a woman I'd never previously met." His dark eyes held mine steadily. "My world operates on suspicion, Professor Cross. When I deviate from established patterns, people pay attention. Some of those people have unfriendly intentions." My stomach dropped. "Are you saying I'm in danger because you bought me a glass of wine?" "I'm saying I was careless, and I'm correcting it now." His voice carried genuine regret, an emotion that seemed foreign on his controlled features. "I should have anticipated the interest my attention would generate. I should have taken precautions before approaching you, not after. This was wild. This was absolutely, categorically wild." I was sitting in my neighborhood coffee shop discussing protection details with a Mafia boss, as if we were negotiating parking arrangements. "I don't want your protection," I said firmly. "I don't want anything to do with whatever world you're operating in. I think you should leave." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of pained acceptance that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. "You researched me," he said quietly. "You know what I am." "Yes, and you're afraid." "I'm not afraid," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "I'm angry. I'm angry that you inserted yourself into my life without my consent. I'm angry that your attention apparently puts me at risk. And I'm angry that I still don't understand why you came to that book club in the first place." He was silent for a long moment, and I watched something war behind his eyes. Calculation versus honesty, protection versus vulnerability. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "I came because of a review you wrote," he said. 6 months ago, an academic journal published your analysis of villain archetypes in Victorian literature. The argument you made about society creating its own monsters, about the hypocrisy of condemning individuals while ignoring systemic failures." He paused. "I've read it perhaps 100 times. The revelation stunned me into silence. My academic work barely registered with my own department. The idea that a Mafia boss had been reading my journal articles felt like stepping into an alternate reality. "Why?" I finally managed. "Because you articulated something I've felt my entire life but could never explain." He leaned forward, intensity radiating from every line of his body. You understand that the universe doesn't draw the line between hero and villain. It's drawn by the people who get to write history. And I have spent 30 years on the wrong side of that line, doing what I believed was necessary, watching people who've done far worse receive praise, because they wear suits and sit in boardrooms instead of operating in the shadows. Are you comparing yourself to corrupt business people? I'm comparing myself to everyone who makes ugly choices and calls them necessary. His voice dropped lower, urgent with the need to be understood. Politicians who bomb civilians and call it foreign policy. Pharmaceutical executives who price medication beyond reach and call it market economics. Landlords who evict families during winter and call it property rights. The world is full of villains in respectable clothing. I had the misfortune of being born into a family that never learned to disguise its villainy as virtue. The coffee shop continued its cheerful weekend bustle around us, completely unaware that something seismic was happening at the corner table. "And what about the violence?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The people your family has hurt. The lives that ended because of decisions you made." His expression didn't flinch. "I've made choices I'll carry until I die. Some I regret. Others I would make again because the alternative was worse. I'm not asking you to absolve me, Professor Cross. I'm asking whether you meant what you said in that bookshop, whether understanding is genuinely possible, or whether your compassion for villains only extends to the fictional ones." The question cut straight through every intellectual defense I'd ever constructed. I opened my mouth to respond, but his phone buzzed with a distinctive pattern that made his entire body go rigid. He glanced at the screen, and the color drained from his face. "Get under the table," he said, his voice suddenly sharp as broken glass. "Now." "What?" The coffee shop window exploded. Glass rained across the coffee shop like deadly confetti, catching afternoon sunlight as it fell. Screams erupted from every direction, chairs scraping, bodies hitting the floor, the primal chaos of people who'd never experienced violence suddenly drowning in it. Dante moved before I could process what was happening. One moment, he was sitting across from me, the next. His body was covering mine beneath the table, his weight pressing me into the hardwood. Flora's a second shot, punched through the space where my head had been. "Stay down." His voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. Like this was Tuesday morning routine rather than attempted murder. "Don't move until I tell you." Another shot, then another. The barista was screaming, a high, thin sound that would haunt my nightmares for months. Someone near the door was crying for help, their voice wet with pain. Dante's hand found mine in the chaos, his grip firm and steadying. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his mouth close to my ear. "When I move, you stay exactly where you are. Count to 30, then crawl toward the back hallway. There's an emergency exit that leads to the alley. A black car will be waiting. Get in, do you understand? I can't just leave you here." His laugh was low and dangerous. "I've survived far worse than this, Professor. But I need to know you're safe before I can handle it properly." Before I could argue, he was gone, moving low and fast toward the shattered window, toward the source of the gunfire, toward danger rather than away from it. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to flee, to let him handle whatever nightmare had just erupted around us. Instead, I started counting. 1, 2, 3. More shots outside now, exchanged rather than one-sided. Dante's voice was shouting something in Italian, harsh and commanding. 7, 8, 9. A body hit the pavement outside with a sound I would never forget, heavy and final and utterly without dignity. 15, 16, 17. The screaming inside the coffee shop had faded to whimpers, survivors hiding beneath tables and behind counters afraid to move. I caught a glimpse of the barista pressed against the espresso machine, blood streaming from cuts on her arms, her eyes blank with shock. 23, 24, 25. Silence from outside. The kind of silence that follows violence, thick and ringing, waiting for the subsequent explosion. 28, 29, 30. I crawled toward the back hallway on hands and knees, broken glass biting into my palms, my professor's tweed jacket now smeared with coffee and blood that might or might not be mine. The emergency exit was exactly where Dante had said it would be. The alley beyond was narrow and dark despite the afternoon sun. The black car idled 10 feet away, its engine humming with quiet power. The rear door swung open as I approached, revealing a leather interior and a driver who didn't turn around. "Get in," a female voice commanded. "We have 90 seconds before the police arrive." I got in. The car was moving before I'd fully closed the door. accelerating through back streets with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every possible escape route. I caught glimpses of the coffee shop receding in the side mirror, of flashing lights approaching from multiple directions, of the chaos I'd somehow survived. "You're bleeding," the woman observed, her eyes finding mine in the rearview mirror. I looked down at my hands, at the glass shards embedded in my palms, at the blood dripping onto leather seats that probably cost more than my car. "Oh," I said stupidly, "yes. There's a first aid kit under the seat." She took a corner at speed, throwing me against the door. "We'll handle proper medical attention once we're secure." "Where's Dante?" "Handling the situation." "Is he okay?" Her silence stretched long enough to become an answer I didn't want. The safe house was a brownstone, in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. Expensive and anonymous. The kind of place wealthy people maintained for reasons they never explained to anyone. The woman, who introduced herself only as Sarah, led me through a security system that required 3 separate codes and a biometric scan. Inside was sparse but comfortable. Hardwood floors, minimal furniture. The feeling of a space designed for function rather than living. "Sit," Sarah commanded, gesturing toward a leather couch. "Let me see your hands." She worked in efficient silence, extracting glass fragments with tweezers and applying antiseptic that burned like fire. I studied her while she worked, trying to place her in the hierarchy of Dante's world. Late 20s, athletic build, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She moved with the same controlled grace Dante possessed, the economy of someone trained to be dangerous. "How long have you worked for him?" I asked, more to break the silence than from genuine curiosity. 12 years. She didn't look up from her work since I was 16. That's very young to join a criminal organization. Her hands stilled for just a moment. "I didn't join. I was recruited." "There's a difference." "Recruited from where?" Now she did look up, her dark eyes assessing me with new interest. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who just survived an assassination attempt." "I ask a lot of questions because I just survived an assassination attempt, and I have no idea what's happening or why." Sarah was quiet for a moment, wrapping bandages around my palms with practiced care. "Dante found me in a group home on the south side," she said finally. "I'd aged out of foster care with no prospects, no education, no future. The options for girls like me were limited, and none of them were good. He offered me something different. Training, purpose, and a family that actually protected its members." She finished the bandaging and sat back. "I would die for him. Not because he demands it, because he's the only person who ever treated me like I was worth saving." The front door opened before I could respond, and Dante walked in, looking like he'd just returned from a war. His sweater was torn, blood staining the charcoal fabric in patterns I didn't want to analyze. His face was composed, but his eyes carried a darkness that made my stomach clench. "Report," he said to Sarah, not looking at me. 3 shooters, all neutralized. No identification yet, but the weapons suggest ties to Moretti. Police are treating it as gang violence. No witnesses contradict that narrative. Civilian casualties? 7 injured, none critical. The coffee shop owner took shrapnel to the shoulder, but she'll recover. Dante closed his eyes for a moment, and I watched something like grief pass across his features. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "I exposed her. I was careless, and now innocent people are hurt." He was talking about me, about the chain of events that had led from a bookshop conversation to bullets shattering windows. "Who are the Morettis?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Dante's eyes opened, fixing on me with an intensity that stole my breath. "The Morettis are a family who believe that my approach to business is weak," he said. "They think I've gone soft. My refusal to engage in certain activities makes me vulnerable. They've been looking for leverage against me for years. And now, thanks to my own foolishness, they believe they've found it. Me, I'm the leverage." He crossed the room to stand before me, close enough that I could smell smoke and copper on his skin. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words carried weight I hadn't expected. "I never intended to put you in danger. I only wanted to talk to someone who might understand." "Well," I said, hearing the hysteria creeping into my voice, "we've certainly moved beyond talking at this point." His expression cracked, just slightly. revealing something vulnerable beneath the controlled surface. "I can make arrangements for you to disappear," he said quietly. "New identity, new location, enough money to start over somewhere the Morettis will never find you. You can walk away from this right now and never look back." It was the rational choice, the smart choice, the choice that any sensible person would make without hesitation. I looked at my bandaged hands, at the blood on my ruined jacket, at the man standing before me who'd thrown himself over my body without hesitation when bullets started flying. "If I disappear," I said slowly, "what happens to you? That's not your concern. Answer the question." His jaw tightened. "The Morettis will view my failure to protect you as confirmation of weakness. They'll accelerate their plans to challenge my territory. More people will get hurt. People who depend on me to maintain the stability that keeps them safe. So my disappearance doesn't actually solve the problem. It solves your problem." I stood up, ignoring the pain in my hands, ignoring the rational voice in my head screaming that this was madness. "You asked me in that wine bar whether villains deserve understanding," I said. "Whether someone like me could extend grace to a real monster instead of just fictional ones." His expression flickered with something I couldn't name. "I didn't answer you then, but I think you deserve an answer now." I stepped closer, close enough to see the exhaustion beneath his careful composure, the loneliness behind his controlled facade. "I'm not running." The safe house became my world for the next 3 days. 4 walls of expensive anonymity, windows that didn't open, and a security detail that rotated every 8 hours with military precision. Sarah brought me clothes from my apartment, books from my office, even the stack of ungraded essays that I attacked with desperate focus, because the alternative was to think about the fact that my life had become unrecognizable. Dante visited every evening, arriving after dark and staying until the small hours of the morning. We talked about everything except the obvious: Victorian literature and Italian cinema, Chicago politics and Mediterranean cooking, the philosophy of moral responsibility, and the best pizza in the city. He was brilliant, I discovered. Not just intelligent, but genuinely brilliant. The kind of mind that made unexpected connections and asked questions that reframed everything you thought you knew. He'd never finished high school. The revelation came casually, dropped into a conversation about educational inequality, as if it were nothing significant. My father believed formal education was a waste of time for someone destined to run the family business, he explained, swirling whiskey in a crystal glass. I learned what I needed from tutors, from experience, from books I read in secret because Marco Russo thought his son should be learning to hurt people instead of understanding them. "But you read everything," I said. "Philosophy, history, literature. You quoted Dostoevsky at me yesterday like it was a casual conversation." I read everything because I was trying to understand how I ended up in a life I never chose. His eyes found mine across the dimly lit room. When you're born into violence, you either embrace it without question, or you spend your entire existence trying to find another way. I chose the latter. Books were my escape route, even when I couldn't physically escape. The intimacy of these conversations terrified me more than the assassination attempt had. I was supposed to be a hostage, a liability, a problem to be managed. Instead, I was becoming something far more dangerous. I was becoming someone who understood Dante Russo, who saw past the reputation to the man underneath, who looked forward to his evening visits with an anticipation that felt like falling. On the 4th day, he arrived earlier than usual, his expression carrying a gravity that made my stomach clench. "We need to discuss your situation," he said, settling into the chair across from my spot on the couch. "The Morettis have made their intentions clear." He slid a photograph across the coffee table. A woman I didn't recognize, with Mediterranean features, dark hair, and lifeless eyes staring at nothing. "Lucia Ferrara," Dante said quietly. "She was a translator who worked for a family allied with mine. The Morettis suspected she was passing information, though she wasn't. They made an example of her to send a message about what happens to women who get too close to their enemies." My throat constricted. "And you're showing me this because you need to understand what we're dealing with." His voice carried no emotion, but his hands had tightened into fists. "The Morettis don't operate by the rules I've tried to establish. They don't distinguish between combatants and civilians, between legitimate targets and innocent bystanders. To them, you're not a person. You're a pressure point. I stared at the photograph, at the woman who died simply for being adjacent to the wrong world. What are my options? I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Disappear and hope they lose interest. That's still on the table. We already discussed why that doesn't actually solve anything. No, he agreed, it doesn't. Which brings us to option 2. He produced a second photograph. A warehouse on the outskirts of the city, industrial and anonymous. The Morettis are planning something significant. My intelligence suggests they're consolidating resources for a substantial move against my territory. If I can disrupt their operation before it launches, the threat to you diminishes substantially. But I need information I don't currently have. And you're telling me this because you have skills I lack. His eyes held mine with that intensity I'd learned to recognize. You can read people, Vivian. You see patterns in behavior that most people miss entirely. That's what drew me to you in the first place. Your analysis of fictional villains demonstrated an understanding of psychological motivation that most trained investigators never develop. I felt the pieces clicking together, forming a picture I didn't want to see. You want me to help you. I want to offer you a choice. He leaned forward, urgent to be understood. I could handle this without you. It would take longer, cost more, and risk more lives. Or you could use the skills you've spent your entire academic career developing for something that actually matters. Not analyzing dead authors, but understanding living people who pose real threats. You're asking me to join your organization. I'm asking you to consult on a specific problem, with clear boundaries and a defined endpoint. His expression was careful, controlled. Once the Moretti situation is resolved, you return to your everyday life. No obligations, no ongoing involvement, no permanent entanglement with my world. The word normal felt laughable. My everyday life had included grading essays and running book clubs, not hiding in safe houses while crime families debated whether to kill me. What exactly would I be doing? Attending a social function with me tomorrow evening. He said it casually, as if it were a reasonable request. A charity gala hosted by a family that maintains connections to both the Russo and Moretti organizations. Several key figures will be present, people whose loyalties are uncertain. I need to know who can be trusted and who's already aligned with my enemies. You want me to profile mob figures psychologically at a cocktail party. I want you to do what you did at the bookshop. Observe, analyze, and identify the tells that reveal truth beneath performance. His ghost of a smile appeared. Consider it field work for your research on villain archetypes. The absurdity of the situation struck me with sudden force. A week ago, I'd been worried about whether my adjunct contract would be renewed. Now I was being recruited to analyze criminal psychology at Mafia social events. What if I say no? Then I continue with my existing plans, and you remain here under protection until the situation resolves itself. His voice carried no threat, only tired acceptance. I won't force you into anything, Vivian. I've spent my entire life having choices made for me. I won't do that to someone else. It was the right thing to say, and he knew it. The manipulation was transparent and somehow still effective, because beneath the calculation I could see genuine conviction. Dante Russo actually believed in consent, in choice, in treating people as autonomous agents rather than pieces on a board. That belief was more seductive than any threat could have been. Tell me about the gala, I said. His expression flickered with something that might have been relief. The Castellani family hosts it annually, a fundraiser for children's hospitals that serves as neutral ground for various interested parties. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through photographs of elegantly dressed people in expensive settings. Lorenzo Castellani has maintained careful neutrality between my organization and the Morettis, but I have reason to believe he's being pressured to choose a side. Understanding where his loyalties actually lie could determine how the next several months unfold. And you can't just ask him directly. In my world, direct questions receive performed answers. People say what they believe you want to hear, what keeps them safest, what maintains their options. The truth lives in micro-expressions, in word choices, in the gaps between what people say and how they say it. Which is where I come in, which is where you come in. I studied the photographs on his phone, faces that meant nothing to me yet, lives entangled in webs I was only beginning to understand. I'll need background on everyone significant who'll be attending, I said. Family histories, business relationships, known conflicts and alliances. I can't read behavior accurately without context for what I'm observing. Sarah will provide complete dossiers by morning, and I'll need appropriate clothing. I gestured at my current outfit, yoga pants, and an oversized sweater Sarah had retrieved from my apartment. I don't think this meets charity gala dress codes. That ghost of a smile deepened into something almost warm. I believe Sarah has already anticipated that requirement. Of course she had. Everything about Dante's organization operated on anticipation, on preparation, on having contingencies for contingencies. One more thing, I said, holding his gaze. If I do this, I need your honesty. Complete honesty about what I'm walking into, what the risks are, and what you're actually hoping to accomplish. I won't be a pawn moving unthinkingly across a board I don't understand. He was silent for a long moment, something warring behind his dark eyes. Complete honesty is dangerous, he said finally. Once you know certain things, you can't unknow them. The information itself becomes a liability. Then I need to trust that you'll tell me what I need to know and protect me from what I don't. I held his gaze steadily. Can you do that? Another long silence. Then, slowly, he nodded. I can try. It wasn't the commitment I'd asked for, but from a man who'd spent his entire life trusting no one, it felt like more than I had any right to expect. The dossiers arrived at dawn, delivered by Sarah with her usual efficient silence. I spent the entire day reading, memorizing names and faces and relationship webs, building psychological profiles of people I'd never met, based on their histories and known behaviors. It was the most engaging academic work I'd done in years, I realized with uncomfortable irony. More engaging than any journal article, conference paper, or lecture preparation. Sarah interrupted my studies in the late afternoon, carrying a garment bag and a case that I assumed contained makeup. Time to get ready, she announced, unzipping the bag to reveal a gown that probably cost more than my annual salary. Dante selected it himself. The dress was deep emerald green, elegant without being ostentatious, cut to flatter without being provocative, professional enough for serious work, beautiful enough to attract attention. He has good taste, I admitted. Sarah's expression flickered with something I couldn't read. He wanted you to feel confident, she said. Not like a costume. Like yourself, only more so. It was such an unexpectedly thoughtful gesture that I didn't know how to respond. 2 hours later, I stood in front of a full-length mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at me. Sarah had worked magic with makeup and hair, transforming my usual academic dishevelment into something polished and commanding. The emerald dress fit like it had been made for me, probably because it had been. Dante appeared in the doorway, his reflection joining mine in the mirror. He wore a black suit that made his previous attire look casual, cut with the precision that I'd learned indicated serious money and serious intent. You look, he started, then stopped. Something in his expression shifted, the careful control slipping for just a moment. Stunning, he finished quietly. You look absolutely gorgeous. Heat crept up my neck, unexpected and unwelcome. Don't be charming, I said, adjusting an earring to avoid his gaze. I need to focus tonight, not worry about whether you're manipulating me with compliments. His reflection smiled, sharp and dangerous and somehow sad. What if the compliment is simply genuine? Then repeat it when we're not about to walk into a room full of people who might want us dead. I turned to face him directly. It'll mean more if I survive to hear it. His smile faded, replaced by something fierce and protective. You'll survive, he said. I'll make sure of it. The Castellani estate sprawled across 20 acres of manicured lakefront property, the kind of old money elegance that whispered rather than shouted its wealth. As our car approached the main entrance, I counted security personnel positioned at strategic intervals, their formal attire doing nothing to disguise the alertness in their postures. Lorenzo Castellani takes neutrality seriously, Dante observed, following my gaze. Armed guards from 3 different organizations, none permitted to carry weapons inside. He pulled back his jacket to reveal an empty holster. Even I comply with his rules on his territory. And if something goes wrong inside, then we rely on wit rather than weaponry. His ghost of a smile appeared. I suspect you'll find that more comfortable than the alternative. The ballroom was a cathedral of crystal and candlelight, designed to make everyone inside feel simultaneously important and slightly inadequate. Hundreds of guests circulated in carefully choreographed patterns, their conversations creating a constant hum beneath the string quartet playing something classical and forgettable. I spotted our first target almost immediately. Lorenzo Castellani held court near the center of the room, a silver-haired patriarch whose easy smile and relaxed posture spoke of absolute confidence in his own domain. He was flanked by two younger men I recognized from the dossiers as his sons, both watching the crowd with the sharp attention of people assessing threats and opportunities simultaneously. "Initial impressions," Dante murmured, his hand resting lightly on my lower back as we moved through the crowd. "He's performing comfort he doesn't feel," I said quietly. "Watch his left hand. He keeps touching his watch, even though it doesn't need adjusting. Classic self-soothing behavior. Something has him worried." "The sons?" "The older one, Marco, is genuinely relaxed. He's confident in his position, sure of outcomes. But the younger one, Tommaso, keeps glancing toward the east entrance. He's waiting for someone specific, and he's not sure whether their arrival will be good or bad news." Dante's hand tightened slightly on my back. "The east entrance is where the Moretti delegation will enter." I filed that information away, adjusting my mental profile of Tommaso Castellani. Possible Moretti sympathizer, or possibly just someone who understood that the Moretti arrival would shift the room's dynamics in unpredictable ways. We made our way toward Lorenzo, Dante greeting acquaintances with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating social minefields. I observed everything, cataloging behavioral data like a researcher documenting a new species. The way conversations shifted when we approached. The micro-expressions of fear, respect, curiosity, and calculation that flickered across faces before social masks slammed back into place. "Dante," Lorenzo Castellani's voice carried genuine warmth as we reached his circle. "It's been too long. And who is this vision you've brought to grace my humble gathering?" "Professor Vivian Cross," Dante said smoothly. "She's consulting on some business matters for me." "Vivian, this is Lorenzo Castellani, our generous host." "Professor." Lorenzo took my hand with old-world courtesy. "What field of study captures your expertise?" "Victorian literature and criminal psychology," I said, overseeing his reaction. Though I'm beginning to think those fields overlap more than most people realize. Lorenzo's smile widened, but his eyes sharpened with new interest. A fascinating combination. "Tell me, Professor, what does criminal psychology teach us about human nature that literature does not?" "Literature shows us what we wish human nature could be. Psychology shows us what it actually is." I held his gaze steadily. The most interesting work happens in the space between those two truths. Something flickered across Lorenzo's face. Approval, perhaps? Or recognition? I felt Dante's hand press slightly against my back. A silent acknowledgement that I'd said exactly the right thing. "You must join us for dinner," Lorenzo said. I find myself suddenly curious about the space between truths. We would be honored. As we moved away, Dante leaned close to my ear. "You impressed him. That's not easy to do." "He's testing us," I replied quietly. "That invitation wasn't hospitality. He wants to observe us in a more intimate setting, see how we interact when we think we're among allies." "And what will he see?" I glanced up at Dante's profile, sharp and controlled in the candlelight. "That depends on how good we are at performing whatever story we want him to believe." His ghost of a smile carried an edge I hadn't seen before. "Then let's give him a story worth believing." The east entrance opened, and the room's energy shifted like a current changing direction. I didn't need to ask who had arrived. The reaction rippled through the crowd in waves of tension and forced casualness. Vittorio Moretti entered like a man who owned every room he walked into, regardless of whose name was on the deed. Shorter than I expected, compact and powerful, with silver hair swept back from a face that reminded me of a Renaissance portrait of a particularly ruthless pope. His entourage spread behind him in practiced formation. Beautiful women and dangerous men arranged for maximum visual impact. "That's him," Dante said unnecessarily. "And the woman on his right is his daughter, Isabella. She handles most of their legitimate business interests. Isabella Moretti was striking rather than beautiful, with sharp features and intelligent eyes that swept the room with the same analytical intensity I'd been employing all evening. When her gaze found us, it lingered for a moment longer than coincidence would explain. "She knows who I am," I said. "She knows who everyone is." Dante's voice carried grudging respect. "Isabella is the most dangerous person in their organization, and most people never realize it because they're too busy underestimating women in this world. And Vittorio? Watch him interact with Lorenzo. That will tell us more than any dossier." We positioned ourselves near enough to observe without appearing to eavesdrop. Lorenzo greeted Vittorio with the same warm courtesy he'd shown Dante, but I caught the differences immediately. The tension in his shoulders, the slightly too bright smile, the way he positioned his sons as a subtle barrier between himself and the Moretti patriarch. "He's afraid," I murmured. "Not of Vittorio personally, but of what Vittorio represents. He's been given an ultimatum of some kind, and tonight is connected to his response." Dante absorbed this with a slight nod. "Can you determine which way he's leaning?" "Not yet. But Tommaso knows something. Watch how he keeps catching Isabella's eye. There's personal history there, and it's affecting his judgment." As if summoned by my observation, Tommaso Castellani detached himself from his father's group and began making his way through the crowd. His trajectory would bring him directly past us. "Dante," he said, his voice carrying forced casualness, "I didn't expect to see you tonight." "Lorenzo's neutrality extends to his guest list," Dante replied smoothly. "As you well know." Tommaso's eyes flickered to me with poorly disguised curiosity. "And your companion?" "Professor Cross is helping me with a research project." "Research." Tommaso's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Is that what we're calling it now?" The insinuation hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. I felt Dante tense beside me, felt the violence coiling beneath his controlled exterior. "Your manners are slipping, Tommaso," I said, before Dante could respond. "Whatever history you have with Dante, it doesn't excuse addressing a stranger with disrespect, particularly at your father's event." Something shifted in Tommaso's expression, surprise perhaps at being called out so directly. "My apologies, Professor." He didn't sound apologetic. "I meant no offense." "Of course you did," I replied calmly. "But I'm choosing to accept your apology anyway, because this evening seems complicated enough without adding unnecessary conflict." Tommaso stared at me for a long moment, reassessing whatever assumptions he'd made. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. "I see why you brought her," he said to Dante. "She's more dangerous than she looks." "Most valuable things are," Dante replied. Tommaso moved on, but not before exchanging another loaded glance with Isabella Moretti across the room. "That was reckless," Dante said quietly. "That was necessary." I kept my voice low, my expression pleasant for any observers. He was trying to establish dominance, to make you react emotionally. If you'd responded aggressively, everyone watching would have seen exactly what he wanted them to see. A volatile leader who can be provoked into mistakes. Dante was silent for a moment. And what do they see now? A united front that can't be easily destabilized. I glanced up at him. Also, his reaction confirmed something important. He's not neutral, not anymore. He's chosen a side, and he's anxious for the conflict to begin so he can stop pretending otherwise. Which side? The answer came before I could speculate, delivered by Isabella Moretti herself. "Mr. Russo," she said, appearing beside us with the silent grace of someone trained to move undetected. "And the famous Professor Cross. I've heard so much about you." "Famous seems like an overstatement," I said carefully. "We've never met. We haven't met personally, no. But your academic work has made quite an impression on certain interested parties." She smiled, and it was the smile of a predator recognizing prey. "Your analysis of villain archetypes, specifically. Some people found it very illuminating. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees." Isabella knew about the journal article, the same one that had initially drawn Dante's attention, which meant the Morettis had been watching me even before the coffee shop attack. "I'm flattered by the interest," I managed. "Academic work rarely finds such engaged readers." "Oh, we're very engaged, Professor." Isabella's smile widened. "In fact, we were hoping to discuss some of your theories in greater detail, perhaps somewhere more private than a crowded ballroom. The invitation was obviously a trap. But declining might be worse, might signal fear that would only encourage further aggression. "I'd be happy to discuss my work," I said, feeling Dante's tension beside me. "But I'm afraid my schedule is rather complicated at the moment. Perhaps we could arrange something for after the current consulting project concludes." "Of course." Isabella produced a card from somewhere, pressing it into my palm with fingers that lingered just slightly too long. "When your schedule clears." "I'm very patient, Professor. It's one of my best qualities." She disappeared back into the crowd, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and unmistakable threat. "We need to leave," Dante said quietly. "Not yet." I was watching Lorenzo Castellani, watching how his expression had shifted during Isabella's approach. He saw that interaction. He's processing it right now, trying to determine what it means. "And what does it mean?" "It means the Morettis are more interested in me than the simple leverage you described." Isabella didn't come over to intimidate. She came to recruit. Dante went very still. "Explain." "She mentioned my academic work specifically, the villain analysis. She's not trying to use me against you, Dante. She's trying to determine whether I might be helpful to them directly, whether my skills could be turned." "Can they?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to examine. "I don't know," I admitted. "A week ago, I would have said no. But a week ago, I didn't know this world existed. I didn't know what I was capable of." Dante's hand found mine, his grip fierce and possessive. "Then let's make sure you never have to find out," he said. Dinner was served in a private salon adjacent to the main ballroom, with 12 guests selected by Lorenzo Castellani, whose reasons became clearer as I studied the seating arrangement. We were positioned at his right hand, a mark of either honor or suspicion, depending on how you interpreted the gesture. Vittorio Moretti sat directly across, his daughter Isabella beside him, their placement creating a visual confrontation that felt entirely deliberate. The other guests formed a careful balance of aligned and neutral parties. I recognized faces from the dossiers, power brokers and decision-makers whose loyalties would shape whatever conflict was brewing beneath the surface of civilized conversation. The soup course arrived with a discussion of charitable initiatives, a safe territory that allowed everyone to perform generosity while assessing enemies. I used the time to observe, building behavioral profiles of each guest based on their micro-expressions and verbal patterns. Lorenzo himself remained the most difficult to read. His performance of relaxed hospitality was nearly flawless, but I'd caught enough tells earlier to know that something significant was weighing on him. The question was whether he'd already made his decision, or whether tonight was genuinely about gathering information before committing. "Professor Cross," Vittorio Moretti's voice cut through the ambient conversation, drawing every eye to our end of the table. "My daughter tells me you've written extensively about the psychology of villains, a fascinating subject for an academic." "All subjects are academic until they become personal," I replied carefully. "That's the point of study. Understanding things before we're forced to experience them directly." Vittorio's smile didn't reach his eyes. "And what has your study taught you? Are villains born or made?" The question was obviously a trap. Any answer could be twisted to serve his purposes. But refusing to engage would signal weakness, and I'd already learned that weakness in this world invited destruction. "Neither," I said. "Villains are chosen." A murmur rippled around the table. Even Dante shifted slightly beside me, his attention sharpening. "Explain," Vittorio commanded. "Every person at this table has faced moments where they had to choose between competing values." I let my gaze sweep across the assembled guests, making eye contact with each in turn. Loyalty or survival, justice or mercy, principle or pragmatism. The people we call villains are simply those who made choices that the powerful found inconvenient to accept. "You're suggesting villainy is a matter of perspective," Lorenzo said, his tone carefully neutral. "That there's no objective moral truth. I'm suggesting that objective moral truth is a luxury afforded to those who've never had to make impossible decisions." I held Lorenzo's gaze steadily. Easy to condemn violence when you've never faced a situation where violence was the only path to survival. Easy to preach forgiveness when you've never lost someone to cruelty that forgiveness would only enable. The table had gone very quiet. I could feel the tension radiating from multiple directions, alliances and enmities crystallizing around my words. "The professor makes an interesting point," Isabella Moretti said smoothly. "But surely some choices are simply wrong. Murder, for instance. Surely we can agree that taking a life crosses a line that context cannot excuse. Can we?" I turned to face her directly. What about a mother who kills to protect her children? A soldier who kills to defend her country? An executioner who kills because the law demands it? We've carved out countless exceptions to the prohibition against killing, all of them justified by context and necessity. The only real question is who decides which exceptions are legitimate. "And who do you believe should make that decision, Professor?" Vittorio's voice carried a new edge, the casual curiosity sharpening into something more dangerous. "The people who have to live with the consequences." I didn't flinch from his stare. Not distant authorities applying abstract principles. Not comfortable observers who've never faced the choices being judged. The people whose hands get dirty, who carry the weight of what they've done, who have to look at themselves in the mirror every morning and find a way to keep going. Silence held for a long moment. Then Lorenzo Castellani began to laugh. "Dante," he said, raising his wine glass in a toast. "Wherever did you find this woman? She's magnificent." The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted, redirected by Lorenzo's deliberate intervention. Conversation resumed around the table, but I could feel the recalibrations happening in real time. My little speech had landed somewhere significant, had touched on something that mattered to the people in this room in ways I was only beginning to understand. Dante's hand found my knee beneath the table, his touch carrying a message I couldn't quite decipher. Approval, perhaps, or warning, or something else entirely. The main course arrived, and the conversation fragmented into smaller discussions. I found myself drawn into an exchange with the woman on my right, a financier named Carmela, whose connections to various organizations made her a valuable source of neutral intelligence. "You've made quite an impression," she murmured, her voice pitched for privacy. "Both sides are reassessing their assumptions about you." "Both sides," I repeated. "That suggests a conflict I'm only partially aware of." Carmela's smile was knowing. The Russo and Moretti families have been circling each other for years. Lorenzo's neutrality has maintained a balance that many people depend on. But neutrality has costs, and those costs are becoming increasingly difficult to bear. "What kind of costs?" "The kind that gets people killed." She sipped her wine with studied casualness. "The Morettis are expanding aggressively, absorbing smaller organizations, eliminating competition. Lorenzo's territory sits directly in their path. He can align with them and survive, or resist and face consequences. And Dante? Dante represents a third option." Carmela's gaze flickered toward him with something that might have been respect. He's been building alliances with other families who share his concerns about Moretti's expansion. A coalition of the unwilling, if you will. Lorenzo's choice will determine whether that coalition has enough strength to matter. The political landscape snapped into focus with sudden clarity. This wasn't just about me, or even about the personal conflict between Dante and the Morettis. This was about the future of organized crime in Chicago. About whether power would consolidate under Moretti's brutality or distribute among a coalition of more moderate voices. And I just announced my philosophical alignment in front of everyone who mattered. After dinner, the guests dispersed into smaller conversations throughout the salon. I found myself momentarily alone, Dante drawn into a discussion with several men I didn't recognize, and I used the opportunity to observe without the pressure of performance. Isabella Moretti approached before I could retreat to safer territory. "You handled my father well," she said, settling beside me with the casual intimacy of an old friend. "Most people either grovel or challenge. You did neither." I answered his question honestly. Honesty isn't a strategy. "Everything is a strategy, Professor." Isabella's smile carried sharp edges. "The only question is whether you're aware of the game you're playing. Is this the part where you try to recruit me again? This is the part where I offer you information freely given." Her voice dropped lower, forcing me to lean in to hear. "My father wants to destroy Dante Russo. Not just defeat him. Eradicate him. Everything he's built, everyone he cares about, every hope he has for a different kind of future. And you, Professor, have just painted a target on yourself that my father will not ignore. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm not my father. Something flickered in Isabella's expression, something that looked almost like sincerity. And because I'm curious what you'll do with the information. She walked away before I could respond, leaving me with questions that multiplied faster than I could process them. Dante appeared at my side moments later, his expression carefully neutral for any observers. What did she say? She told me your destruction is her father's primary objective. I kept my voice steady, despite the fear coiling in my stomach, and she implied that she might not share his enthusiasm for that goal. Isabella is many things, but she's not stupid. Dante guided me toward a quieter corner of the salon. She knows her father's methods are unsustainable. The brutality that built their empire is the same brutality that will eventually destroy it. You think she's positioning herself for a future without him? I think she's keeping her options open. His ghost of a smile carried something that might have been admiration. Much like you, actually. Intelligent women navigating dangerous worlds controlled by men with more power than wisdom. Is that how you see yourself? A man with more power than wisdom. His expression shifted, the careful control slipping just enough to reveal something vulnerable beneath. I see myself as someone trying to build something different, he said quietly. Something my daughter could inherit without being ashamed of its origins. The revelation hit me like a splash of cold water. Do you have a daughter? Had. His voice carried ancient grief, the kind that never fully heals. Sophia was 7 when she died. Leukemia. The same year, I took control of the family. Dante. He held up a hand, forestalling the sympathy he clearly couldn't bear. The point is that her death changed everything about how I saw my legacy. I looked at the world I'd inherited, the violence and corruption and endless cycles of retribution, and I couldn't imagine explaining any of it to her. Couldn't imagine her asking why people had to die for our family to prosper. So you started changing things. So I started trying. He met my eyes with devastating honesty. Every decision I've made for the past 12 years has been shaped by one question. What would Sophia think of her father? It's not enough. It can't undo the past or erase the blood on my hands. But it's all I have. The noise of the salon faded around us. The political machinations and strategic calculations momentarily irrelevant in the face of raw human grief. That's why you came to the book club, I said slowly. That's why you were drawn to my analysis of villains. You're trying to understand whether redemption is possible. Whether someone who's done terrible things can become something else. I'm trying to understand whether understanding is possible, he corrected. Whether anyone could know the whole truth of what I am, and still see something worth saving. I reached for his hand, propriety and observation be damned. I see you, I said quietly. Not the reputation, or the power, or the carefully constructed image. You. And what I see is someone who carries impossible weight every single day, and somehow still tries to be better than the circumstances that made him who he is. His fingers intertwined with mine, gripping with an intensity that spoke louder than words. Vivian. The way he said my name, like a prayer and a confession combined, made my chest ache with emotions I couldn't name. We should go, I said before someone notices us being human in public. His laugh was low, broken, and beautiful. Yes, we should, but neither of us moved. We stood in that corner of Lorenzo Castellani's salon, hands intertwined, surrounded by enemies and uncertain allies, and for one impossible moment, none of it mattered. Then Sarah appeared at Dante's elbow, her expression carrying urgency that shattered the moment. We have a problem, she said quietly. Tommaso Castellani just made a phone call. 3 minutes later, a convoy of vehicles departed the Moretti compound heading this direction. How many vehicles? 8. Dante's entire demeanor transformed, the vulnerability vanishing beneath cold calculation. That's not a social visit, I said. No. His jaw tightened. That's an assault force. The next 90 seconds revealed exactly how Dante's organization operated under pressure. Sarah was already speaking into a concealed earpiece, coordinating responses I couldn't hear. 2 men I hadn't noticed before materialized from the crowd, positioning themselves near exits with the casual alertness of professionals awaiting instructions. "Lorenzo," Dante said, approaching our host with a calm that betrayed nothing of the crisis unfolding. "It appears some uninvited guests are approaching your property. I thought you should know before they arrive." Lorenzo's expression flickered through surprise, calculation, and finally something that looked like resignation. "Tommaso," he said quietly. "My own son." "I'm afraid so." The older man aged 10 years in the space of a heartbeat. I suspected, but hoping and knowing are different things. He straightened his shoulders with visible effort. "What do you need from me?" "Your security systems and a clear path to the East Wing." Dante's voice carried no judgment, only pragmatic focus. "And your word that whatever happens tonight, the Castellani family's neutrality ends here." Lorenzo held his gaze for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "You have it. And Dante?" "Make sure my son survives this. Whatever else happens, he's still my blood. I'll do what I can." It wasn't a promise, and Lorenzo knew it. But it was the best either of them could offer under the circumstances. Sarah appeared at my elbow. "Professor, we need to move you to a secure location." "No." The word came out before I'd consciously decided to say it. "I'm not hiding while other people fight battles that exist because of me." Dante turned, his expression carrying a conflict I recognized. The protector is warring with the pragmatist. "Vivian, this isn't a book club debate. These people will kill you without hesitation. These people are coming because the Morettis want to send a message about what happens to anyone connected to you." I held his gaze steadily. "If I hide, that message succeeds. If I stand beside you, it fails. You could die. I could die hiding too. At least this way. I die making a choice instead of having one made for me." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who understood that some things mattered more than survival. "Stay close to Sarah," he said finally. "Do exactly what she tells you. And if things go badly, you run. You don't look back. You don't try to help. You run. Understood?" "Understood." He held my gaze for one more moment. Something unspoken passing between us. Then he was moving, issuing orders to his people with the quiet authority of someone who'd commanded in crisis many times before. The east wing of the Castellani estate was designed for defensive purposes, whether intentionally or not. Narrow corridors, limited entry points, plenty of cover for defenders. Lorenzo's security forces merged with Dante's people in a display of cooperation that felt like watching history pivot in real time. I positioned myself behind an overturned table with Sarah, the absurdity of my situation hitting me with sudden force. A week ago, I'd been grading essays about Victorian mortality. Now I was crouched behind furniture in a mansion, waiting for a Mafia assault while wearing a designer gown. Life, I learned, had a dark sense of humor. The first shots came from outside, sharp cracks that shattered windows and sent crystal chandeliers swaying. Return fire erupted from defensive positions, the sound enormous in the enclosed space. "Stay down," Sarah commanded, her weapon drawn and steady. "This is the distraction. The real assault will come from somewhere else." She was right. Moments later, an explosion rocked the building's north side, the sound reverberating through the floor beneath us. Shouts and gunfire intensified, the chaos of genuine combat replacing the controlled exchange of the opening moments. Through the smoke and confusion, I caught glimpses of Dante moving with a grace that seemed impossible under the circumstances. He wasn't hiding behind cover like the others. He was directing, coordinating, and occasionally engaging directly when threats emerged, a conductor orchestrating violence with the same precision he brought to everything else. "Professor," Sarah's voice was sharp, "we need to relocate, now." She pulled me through corridors I couldn't have navigated alone, her knowledge of the building suggesting she'd studied the layout long before tonight. We passed bodies I tried not to look at, heard sounds I tried not to process, and moved through a nightmare that felt simultaneously endless and instantaneous. We emerged into what appeared to be a service kitchen, with commercial equipment gleaming under emergency lighting. Sarah pressed me against a wall, her body positioning creating a shield I hadn't asked for. "There's a vehicle waiting in the service entrance," she said. "If we get separated, you go directly there. The driver knows to take you somewhere safe." I'm not leaving without Dante. You'll do what's necessary to survive. Her voice carried no room for argument. That's what he would want. That's what I'm ordering you to do. Before I could respond, the kitchen door exploded inward. Tommaso Castellani stood in the doorway, weapon raised, his face twisted with something that looked like desperate grief. Behind him, 2 men in tactical gear covered the room with automatic weapons. "Professor Cross," Tommaso said, his voice carrying a strange calm. "You're coming with me." Sarah moved before I could process what was happening, her body interposing between me and the threat. "I won't let you take her. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Lower your weapon." Sarah fired twice, dropping one of the tactical operators before the other returned fire. She staggered, hit somewhere I couldn't see, but stayed on her feet. "Run!" she commanded. "Now!" I couldn't move. Fear and shock had frozen me in place, my academic training utterly useless in the face of genuine violence. Tommaso advanced, weapon steady. "The Morettis are offering a simple exchange," he said. "You for peace. Your life for an end to this conflict. It's not personal, Professor. It's just business. Everything is personal." Dante's voice came from somewhere behind Tommaso, cold and precise, especially business. Tommaso spun, but Dante was already moving. The next few seconds blurred into a sequence of violence I couldn't track. Bodies impacting, weapons discharging, the sound of bone meeting bone. When clarity returned, Dante stood over Tommaso's prone form, his face bloody and his breathing ragged, but unmistakably victorious. "Sarah," he said. "I'm fine." She didn't sound fine, but she was standing, flesh wound. Dante's eyes found mine, conducting an assessment that seemed to catalog every detail of my condition. "Are you not hurt?" "I'm not hurt. Good." He turned back to Tommaso, who was groaning on the floor but conscious. "Now, we're going to have a conversation about your choice of allies. The aftermath of violence is never as clean as fiction suggests. There were wounds to treat, bodies to manage, and explanations to construct for authorities who would inevitably investigate. I watched Dante navigate all of it with the exhausted competence of someone who'd done this too many times before. Lorenzo Castellani sat with his son in a small study, their conversation hidden behind closed doors. Whatever passed between them, Tommaso emerged looking broken in ways that had nothing to do with physical injuries. The Moretti assault force had retreated when it became clear the operation had failed. Vittorio's gamble had cost him soldiers, resources, and most importantly, his claim to inevitability. He could be fought. He could be beaten. That knowledge would spread through the criminal underworld like wildfire. "You should sleep," Dante said, finding me in the library where I'd retreated to process everything that had happened. "It's nearly dawn. I don't think I can." I stared at shelves of leather-bound books that suddenly seemed like artifacts from another world. Every time I close my eyes, I see Sarah getting shot. I see you fighting Tommaso. I see all of it. That's normal. He settled into the chair beside mine, close enough to touch but not touching. The first time is always the worst. It gets easier. Does it? Or do you get better at hiding how much it costs you? His ghost of a smile carried genuine sadness. Probably both. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the night settling around us like a heavy blanket. I meant what I said earlier. I finally offered to meet with you to understand what you're trying to build. I know you did. That's what terrifies me. Why? Because now you've seen what my world actually looks like. Not the philosophical discussions about villainy and moral complexity, but the blood and chaos and impossible choices. And I'm afraid that seeing the reality will destroy whatever you thought you understood. I turned to face him directly. You think I'm going to run now that I've seen the truth? I think you'd be smart to run. I've never been particularly good at being smart. I reached for his hand, intertwining our fingers the way we had at the gala before everything fell apart. I'm better at being stubborn. At staying when leaving would be easier, choosing complications over comfort. This isn't a book club argument you can win with clever reasoning. His voice was rough with emotion he was barely containing. This is my life. Violence, danger, and moral compromises that never stop demanding more. I know. I squeezed his hand tighter. I've spent my entire career studying villains, trying to understand what makes people choose darkness over light. And what I've learned is that the choice is never as simple as it seems. That the people we call monsters are usually just people who ran out of better options. I'm not a character in a novel, Vivian. I don't get redemption arcs. Maybe not. But you get choices. Every day you get to choose what kind of person you're going to be. And from what I've seen, you keep choosing to be better than your circumstances require. That matters. That's worth something. He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching my face for something I couldn't name. You should know that if you stay, there's no going back. His voice carried weight that settled into my bones. You'll become part of this world, complicit in everything that happens within it. Your old life, your academic career, your comfortable distance from moral complexity. All of it ends. My old life ended the moment I defended a fictional villain against a real one. I held his gaze steadily. The only question now is what I do with the life I have left. And what do you want to do? I want to understand. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere I'd been hiding from myself. I want to use what I know about human behavior to help build something different. Something better than the brutality that came before. His expression shifted, hope and fear warring behind his careful control. You want to work with me. Not just consult on a crisis, but actually participate in what I'm building. I want to matter. I want my skills to serve something more significant than journal articles no one reads. And I want to stop pretending that a comfortable distance from hard choices makes me morally superior to people who have to make them. Dante raised our intertwined hands, pressing his lips to my knuckles with a tenderness that seemed impossible from someone I'd just watched fight for his life. Then stay, he said quietly. Please help me build something worth believing in. The sun was rising over the Castellani estate, golden light streaming through windows that still bore the scars of the night's violence. In that moment, surrounded by the aftermath of battle and the promise of more conflict to come, I made a choice that would define everything that followed. I stayed. Not because it was safe, smart, or sensible. Not because I understood the full implications of what I was agreeing to. But because for the first time in my life, I'd found something worth being brave for. 6 months later, I would stand beside Dante at a different kind of gathering, watching as former enemies became reluctant allies in a coalition that was slowly reshaping Chicago's criminal landscape. The Morettis were contained, not defeated, but no longer expanding. Lorenzo Castellani had become one of our strongest supporters, and his son, Tommaso, was working to earn back the trust he'd betrayed. I've published no new academic papers. My adjunct contracts had lapsed without renewal. The book club at Chapter and Verse continued under new leadership, the Tuesday night discussions carrying on without me. But I'd found something better than academic recognition. I'd found purpose. Using my skills to assess threats, to identify potential allies, and to understand the psychological dynamics that could turn enemies into partners, or partners into enemies. And I'd found him. The villain who wasn't a villain. The monster who was trying to become something else. The man who'd heard me defend fictional darkness and recognized a kindred spirit worth claiming. Finally, someone who understands. He'd been right, that first night in the bookshop. Understanding was possible. Not easy, never easy,